jumped out of my chest. You never think that would happen in your home so soon, so fast, being that your relative, your little brother who you grew up with, knowing that you never see him again.
Mr. Martin had 9 entrance wounds to his body. There were 2 to the head and neck area, there were 4 in the midsection, and there were 3 in the lower extremities.
When you shoot someone that many times, this isn't a robbery gone bad. He was targeted.
The sad part is, even though the law acquitted him, in the streets, they don't want to hear any of that.
He would die over there, man. If they had beef, it was his beef.
I said, "Aren't you scared?" And he just said, "I'm not scared of nothing."
He kind of put 2 and 2 together. That was some type of payback.
Just before dawn, police in Waterloo, Iowa, receive a call about an injured man near the 1200 block of Washington Street.
So the initial call came in that there was a black male in a pool of blood in the alley. One of the neighbors in the alley had called it in.
Responding officers quickly determined that the victim has already succumbed to his injuries. They searched for evidence to explain his death.
Of particular interest here was the number of bullets, of shell casings. There were, I believe, 5 shell casings found on scene, 3 fired bullets.
They couldn't find any wallet, ID, so initially they had no idea who this black male in the alley that had been killed was. They did notice some tattoos on his arms, and one of our officers was good enough to run through our database the tattoos that he saw, and that tattoo ultimately identified him as Shavonda Martin.
Shavonda Chavez Martin was born on January 5, 1996, in Greenwood, Mississippi, to parents Diane Martin and little John Archer Chavez. Shavonda immediately won over his older half-brother, DeAndre.
I remember when he came home in his car seat. He was a smiling baby. He was quiet, like always sitting in his car seat smiling. He was a smiling person. I'm the oldest, and then second, the middle child is Cardarius, and the youngest was Shavonda.
DeAndre, he always been like the smart one, the focused one. Then you got me, I always was the class clown. Then you got Shavonda, he had his own type of personality. Funny, caring, had the biggest heart.
A lot of times, it was just us, kind of us against the world, you know. My mom raised us alone. Dad wasn't there. We lived with family members, being around cousins.
We grew up since we was kids. Like, when we stayed together at my mom's house, it used to be everybody. When we lived in Mississippi, it used to be everybody.
It was fun, rough moments, tough moments, sad moments. But I think that's what made us strong at the end of the day.
In the early 2000s, the extended family decided to move from Mississippi to Waterloo, Iowa.
My parents decided that they wanted something better in Mississippi. There's no money down there. It's like my dad got tired of working for bare minimal and he wanted more, so we moved up here.
The move from a predominantly black city with only 15,000 residents to a predominantly white city of 68,000 came with some culture shock. Waterloo didn't offer everything the family had hoped for.
Waterloo is on the list for the worst cities for Black Americans based on household income, based on home ownership versus renting, based on opportunities, whether it be in jobs or specifically related to pay. And I'm telling you, if you are familiar with this area and you drive through the neighborhoods of Waterloo, you can feel that.
Gunplay was, in our neighborhood, is very normal. Hearing shots all the time, police sirens and things like that.
We wasn't like allowed to like go around the block and help because my mom's concerned about safety and stuff, so really tough on us.
Thankfully, the Waterloo community had some strong youth outreach programs.
I had an opportunity to get involved with a soccer program that was beginning in one of the lowest economic schools, elementary schools in Waterloo. And At that, I met Cardarius, and I became his big brother with big brothers, big sisters. Shavandis ended up being on our soccer team the next year.
For the two younger brothers, sports provided an escape and hope for the future.
Shavandis started picking up basketball after I started picking up basketball. He was actually good. Me and Shavandis' conversation was, hey, bro, what you doing? You need to sit there and think about what you're doing. You're really good at basketball, man. Take your talent seriously. Go to school. Like, we need to do something for Mom, get her out of here. We need to continue with this sports, play basketball, whatever we can do to get us out of Iowa.
In high school, Cardarius defined himself as an athlete, but Shavandis gravitated toward other interests.
Shavandis, who was very athletic, but also just didn't have that drive. So a lot of times he would be at a game and you just want more from him. He just didn't want to try. And it was kind of that same thing with school. It was really hard to get him motivated. He just didn't have that motivation that the other two boys had. Maybe he saw that Dre was already the man of the house and Cardarius was kind of the athlete, and he said, what is it for me?
As a teenager, Shavandis started making friends on the streets and getting into trouble for the first time.
I think maybe hearing the gunshots in the neighborhood we lived in, sometimes you can just meet a friend or something, and then that adrenaline you're thinking, and it becomes that. So I think he was just struggling with wanting to be cool and be tough.
Shavandis was pretty smart. I mean, he wasn't stupid. He wasn't the person that just did whatever someone told him to. He was his own person.
He was definitely a little, hard-headed and whatever. When he jumped off the porch, he jumped. It wasn't no coming back from it.
In June 2016, Shavandis was arrested for possession of marijuana with intent to deliver.
Shavandis was probably already on the police radar when he got caught with narcotics and a scale and all of that, and then turned back around a month later, and then now is charged with being in the drive-by shooting.
I think it leads from the teenage years, from like fighting and having beef, and then it kind of like level up to go from fighting with hands to with guns.
Shavandis' attempts to fit in on the streets have dire consequences. When someone loses their life, and Shavandis is held responsible.
There were a couple of people shot, one of them being Octavius Brown, who ended up dying.
Shavandis got arrested for murder. I don't know to this day if he was one with a gun that struck the guy.
Shavandis spent a year and a half in police custody. In early 2018, he went on trial for murder. A jury found him not guilty.
Ultimately, they didn't feel we had enough evidence to put a gun in Shavandis Martin's hands.
I know when he got out, the first thing he did was, he actually said he was done with the streets. He just wanted to work and stay out of trouble.
He was back out, he was working at Tyson Chicken, and he was trying to pretty much reboot and change his life to try to get a low profile and just kind of live life on a better way and a straight and narrow path.
Instead of being in the mode he was before he went in, kind of being on guard when he got out, he's walking around like a changed man. And I think it might have just backfired, letting your guard down,
In the early morning hours on May 31st, 2018, 4 months after he was acquitted of murder and had turned his life around, Shavandis Martin has been murdered.
When I heard the name, it kind of hit close because I had arrested Shavandis Martin for murder roughly 2 years before this incident. During that previous investigation, we got to know each other quite well. My first thought when I learned it was Shavandis in the alley was, this isn't going to be easy. Unfortunately, he had made a lot of people angry, and we knew there was a lot of people that were after him. So it kind of created a wide pool of who might have done this. Made it a little more difficult that I learned his pockets have been gone through and possibly a phone taken. So Initially, we thought, was this possibly a robbery? So that opens up a whole bigger pool of potential people.
Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, searching for anyone who saw or heard the shooting.
A number of the witnesses described what they believed earlier in the morning, around 3:30 in the morning. They believed that there had been a party going on, and they thought they heard fireworks.
Others recognized the sounds as gunshots, but did not call police.
They don't want to call it in and be part of the crime because then their name gets out that they called it in. So we have a lot of people that won't call it in so they don't have to talk to the police.
Moving forward, homicide investigators have one thing to focus on: who killed Shavandez Martin?
Leaving the scene, we didn't have a lot to work with initially. In terms of the actual players, at that moment, we did not know.
In Waterloo, Iowa, police are investigating the shooting of 22-year-old Shavandez Martin. The victim and his family are well known in the community.
It was decided right away, let's go talk to Mom. We went to Diane's house, and I ultimately made the declaration that Shavandez had been murdered. She was obviously distraught and was having a tough time with answering questions, so she wanted her son DeAndre there.
I remember this like it was yesterday. I was in the car. It was me, my fiance, and my daughter. I get a call, and my mom said the police came to our door saying they think Shavandez is dead. I think somebody killed him. And then, honestly, I threw my phone. I hung it up, and I said it killed my brother.
Shavandez's older brother, Cardarius, is away at college when he receives the news via text message from a family friend.
So I called my brother, DeAndre. He answered and told me it was true. And my emotions felt like I couldn't breathe, felt like my heart just jumped out of my chest. You never think that would happen in your home so soon, so fast, being that your relative, your little brother who you grew up with, knowing that you never see him again.
I went to pick my mom up, and we went to where he was killed at. We got to see him just laying there lifeless, like an animal that's been ran over by a car. You can imagine how that can make me feel.
While the family and investigators are still at the scene, they receive information from a bystander who says she knew Shavandez.
We did talk to an ex-girlfriend right away, and the reason we did is because she arrived on the crime scene not knowing it was Shavandez, but eventually finding out, and made comments to an officer that she had just been with him that morning. We learned that at approximately 12:30, Shavandez did come by her house, and they talked for about an hour. After that, he called a friend, got picked up, and that was the last time she saw him. She had no real description of what kind of vehicle it was, just that it was a four-door vehicle, and Shavandez had gotten out of the back driver's seat. She didn't know who was driving and who else was in the vehicle. So now we had a timeline of that 1:30 a.m. where he left his ex-girlfriend's house to the 3:30 where the incident happened. So now we've narrowed that time of 2 hours that we need to figure out what happened in that time.
Investigators approach local businesses to see if anyone has surveillance footage of the area where Shavandez was found.
We did find some cameras, but a lot of times what I run across is a lot of people use dummy cameras. It's just a scare tactic. They're not actually hooked up for recording. So we didn't have anything of the immediate area that Shavandez was located at.
Later, the autopsy shows that more shots were fired than police had previously assumed.
Mr. Martin had 9 entrance wounds to his body. There were 2 to the head and neck area. There were 4 in the midsection, and there were 3 in the lower extremities.
There were 9mm bullets used, as well as .357 or .38 special. .38 special and .357 are a common revolver caliber, so we felt we were dealing with a revolver that wouldn't have left shell casings. So we believe there's 2 shooters because of the 2 guns.
The brutality of the murder also prompts investigators to theorize about motive.
This is a very personal incident. When you shoot someone that many times, this isn't a robbery gone bad. We're leaning more towards this is personal. He was targeted.
Police consider the recent acquittal of Shavandez Martin on murder charges as a potential motive for his murder.
Obviously, Octavius Brown's friends and family were not happy that he was acquitted on the shooting. His group had also created a lot of enemies, so there were always groups after, not necessarily him, but the people he hung out with.
And you kind of put 2 and 2 together. Everybody had common sense. That was some type of payback.
Investigating the murder of 22-year-old Shavandez Martin, police in Waterloo, Iowa, examine allegations that Shavandez was involved in another murder on July 17, 2016.
We had a drive-by shooting on Logan Avenue in Waterloo. We had a driver that was in his 30s, and then we had 3 other juveniles in the car doing the shootings. Through our investigation, we learned that multiple people fired shots at the house, eventually striking 2 and killing a 3rd.
A witness identified Shavandez as one of the 3 shooters. The murder victim was 21-year-old Octavius Brown.
Everything we learned, Octavius Brown was kind of just a wrong place, wrong time, innocent victim in this.
Octavius wasn't even part of anything to do with the streets. He was a guy that was just happened to be around. He had nothing to do with it. Nobody ever known him to do anything in the streets, guys. He just was a person that knew street guys.
Friends and family members of Shavandez Martin believe Shavandez was murdered because of his association with the death of Octavius Brown and his loyalty to the friends allegedly involved in that drive-by shooting.
We learned that Shavandez was very loyal to his friends, would do anything for them.
He loved his friend. He would die over them, man. It's nothing to really go. You could say to him about them. If they had beef, it was his beef. He was the one that was gonna step in for them.
And friends staying loyal and not snitching and all of these different codes that we have as young black men is the reason why Shavandez went down the hole that he went down.
Shavandez was acquitted of murder charges on February 9th, 2018. But the streets may not let go so easily.
The sad part is, even though the law acquitted him, in the streets, they don't want to hear any of that. If you're an alleged shooter of someone's family, we all know it's going to be payback. So he tried to lay low. He tried to work. He tried to keep his head down, stay low, don't go to any clubs like that. But in the back of his mind, I'm pretty sure he knew it was always somebody looking for him, always somebody that was still angry that he made it out.
My best hope for him when he got out was him and my mom just moved. I know Cardarius was living in Minnesota at the time, and then a lot of our families in Mississippi. I was praying that they just moved away. You had to, like, God gave you a second chance. Like, a lot of people, especially young black men, don't get acquitted of murder. So I was like, y'all, you two should just move, but neither one of them wanted to move.
When that's all you know and that's all you ever been around, you haven't traveled much, you don't know what else to do, all your family is there. A lot of times people just feel like they'll just stick around and they'll be okay. They just hope for the best, even though they know they have to look over their shoulders. They just feel more comfortable being in a place that they've always known.
After months of trying to walk the straight and narrow, Shavandez seems to lose himself once again to the streets.
Once he got back around or back in his comfortable environment, he went back to his old ways.
He had gotten out of prison and we were hanging out, and I was just asking what he wanted for his life. It was the last time we hung out, actually. And I just remember him looking at me, and he didn't know. And it was silence. And I'll never forget that silence. And I just said, "Aren't you scared?" And he just said, "I'm not scared of nothing."
I hate that mentality. I hate I'm not scared of nothing. In all reality, you don't have to be afraid for something bad to happen to you. So you being tough sometimes is just escalating a situation for something bad to happen to you.
One day after Shavandez Martin was murdered, investigators are still trying to identify individuals with the motive and the opportunity to kill him.
June 1st, we really kind of hit a brick wall. We didn't have any leads on suspects, so we were just kind of trying to figure out what to do next. It was suggested maybe go talk to Mom again, see if there had been any information she had gathered from friends or family that could help us. It happened to be probably the biggest break that we got in the case.
On June 1st, 2018, detectives in Waterloo, Iowa, pay another visit to the mother of murder victim Shavandez Martin.
Diane wasn't home, but her son Cardarius was. While we were speaking to him, a car with 4 females pulled up, and the driver, later identified as Shavandez's cousin, Tatanisha Hunt, got out of the seat and claimed that she had just been at the bus station and Denasia Martin was trying to leave town.
Denasia is like a third, second cousin to me. She was not my cup of tea at all. She was more so into the streets a lot.
Waterloo being a very tight-knit town, I'm very aware of who Denasia was. So I knew who they were talking about, but I didn't know where she fit into this case.
According to Tatanisha, friends saw Denasia sitting at the bus stop with a man they believed was Raymond Burden Jr. They know Burden as the stepbrother of Octavius Brown, the man Shavandez was accused of murdering.
There had been a lot of hate between Raymond and Shavandez. Shavandez had gotten off of murdering Raymond's brother, Octavius. There was always that hostility towards them. So when we get that name, the timeline starts to make sense.
Tatanisha is suspicious of Denasia and Raymond being together and at the bus stop so soon after the murder. So she goes to confront them.
I speed down there. Me and all my friends, we all speed down there. We like 2 cars deep. They see me pulled up and they hurry up and drove off. I chased them down. I was like following them. Like they was speeding, I was speeding. I chased them all the way out to like Cedar Falls.
However, at a certain point, she saw a police cruiser and slowed down. After that, she lost sight of the vehicle.
I went back to my auntie house. We was out there, the detective come, and I tell them, I'm angry. Like, they was just trying to get to the bus station, get away on the bus.
But at that point, we had no idea what part Denasia played in this, or why she was fleeing town, or why Tatanisha was even looking for her.
According to Tatanisha, a family friend named Muff says he saw Denasia and Shavandez together on the day of the murder.
We learned that Denasia had picked up Shavandez that morning of May 31st and was likely the last person now to see him alive.
Muff was in the car with Denasia when she picked up Shavandez, just hours before he was found dead.
Muff, I actually knew who that was just from previous interactions. I knew where he lived. He was willing to let us in and talk. We learned that, in fact, he was in the car with Denasia when they picked Shavandez up that morning. He put it roughly around 2 o'clock. We asked what happened after they picked Shavandez up. So he said that at the time, he asked Denasia to drop him off at a friend's house near a Walgreens just up the road from where they had picked him up. So then Denasia's alone with Shavandez in her car, being the last person with him. We need to find Denasia.
Detectives go to the Waterloo bus station and request surveillance footage from earlier that day.
Denasia Martin was clearly in a disguise of some sort. Her hair was different. I believe she had sunglasses on. She was attempting to get a bus ticket, I believe, to Chicago, but her bag was too big.
Through the investigation, we also learned that Denasia had an apartment in the alley right next to where Shavonda's was found. We started doing backgrounds on her, figuring out who she hung out with.
Police records prove that Denasia has a long history with Raymond Burton Jr., the stepbrother of Octavius Brown, who Shavonda was acquitted of murdering.
Raymond and Denasia had an on-again, off-again relationship. It was kind of well known through the police department. They had been arrested several times together. They had caused quite the havoc at juvenile detention facilities.
Now, investigators have two prime suspects. And they're not the only ones looking for Raymond and Denasia.
They never went back to the bus station because I was watching. I figured they probably drove out of town because what somebody had told me, they said she was going to Mississippi.
While trying to track down Denasia and Raymond, detectives receive a surprising call.
It did hit kind of stale for about a day, and then we received a phone call from Denasia. She said she was on a bus in, I think, Michigan at the time, but she was on her way to see her dad in Norfolk. At that time, Denasia denied being involved in Shavonda's death, but admitted that she had picked up Shavonda from the apartment complex and was the last person to see him alive. She said she dropped him off in a neighborhood and then went to her boyfriend's house. At the time, I wasn't going to be able to find her boyfriend because he had multiple warrants and didn't want to be found by us. So it left an open alibi there as far as we couldn't prove that, we couldn't disprove it. But the story just didn't seem right to me.
Investigators urge Denasia to come to the police station and tell them everything she knows. But Denasia says she's afraid.
She knew her cousin had died. She also had been receiving some threats as far as being the last person to see her cousin alive. She knew people were looking for her. She was adamant that there was no way she was coming back to Waterloo.
Just days after the murder of Shavonda Martin, police in Waterloo, Iowa have received a call from the victim's cousin, Denasia Martin, that she is willing to cooperate with the investigation, but only from a safe distance.
She was in fear. Everyone was accusing her of killing her cousin, and she just did not feel safe. So it was decided that me and another detective were going to go to Virginia and talk to her in person. When we met at her aunt's house, she gave a better detailed statement about what had happened.
There wasn't a great deal of consistency initially with Miss Martin, but we were able to piece together that she had been with a group of individuals on the 30th, including Raymond Burton. They had been driving around.
She talked about their timeline, gave us places that they stopped. All these things that she was telling us was just information that we needed to follow up on. It was potential video, it was potential records, purchases at gas stations.
Law enforcement was able to go back, track that story, and confirm much of what she had told law enforcement. We obtained video footage from a number of locations in Cedar Rapids, Iowa.
Denasia tells police that toward the end of the night, she and her friend Muff went to pick up Shavonda from his girlfriend's house. Later, she says, they were attacked.
They pulled up to an intersection. Multiple people got out of a car in front of them. And and pulled Shavonda's out of the car at gunpoint. She was able to identify two of the people that were in that car, Raymond Burton and another male. She stated that they ultimately pulled him into a car, drove off, and that was the last time she ever saw her cousin.
After Denasia finishes telling her side of the story, police notice one contradiction. She said Muff was in the car with her when Shavonda was abducted. But that's not the story Muff told police. Investigators decide to re-interview him.
He stated that he was afraid of the people that did this, and that's why he never wanted to tell us what happened. But he finally broke down and agreed to tell us what happened.
It was just her and him in a car. They went and picked up Shavonda. We learned from him that Denasia starts acting very bizarre at that point. She's driving all over the place, slamming on the brakes, says she has to use the restroom, which was odd to him because there had been a gas station nearby. They then go up to Denasia's residence on the same alley where Mr. Martin was found.
She left the two of them in her car. During the statement, Muff says Shavonda is very paranoid, doesn't like it. Even makes the comment that, "I don't like being out here, I don't have a gun, I have no protection."
Eventually, Muff says he saw a gun come through the window next to Shavonda's head.
He stated that a male with a gun told Shavonda, "I got you." At that point, when the gunman started talking, Muff said he knew who it was. He knew it was Raymond Burton.
Raymond Burton ordered Shavonda to get out of the car and walk into the alley behind Denasia's apartment building.
Muff stated that as they're walking back to the alley, another person came from behind the apartment building, joined them, and that's the last time he saw Shavonda.
One of the things that sticks out to me, Mr. Martin knew he was going to be murdered. I don't care who you are, and I don't care what you're accused of been doing. Nobody should have to be put in a position where they are walking to their execution.
Muff tells police he fled the scene before the shooting began.
He was afraid, so he pulled away in the vehicle, but as he was pulling away, he did hear the gunshots.
To build a solid murder case against Raymond Burton Jr., authorities know they'll need more than Muff's testimony. They keep searching for evidence that connects the alleged shooter to the victim.
At the time, I knew what Raymond's Facebook profile was. My first thing was see if there was any communication between them. So on Shavonda's Facebook results, we ended up finding a pretty significant conversation.
Shavonda has social media, so people can still contact you. They can still say things that it's gonna rile you up and make you feel away. So when he started getting contacted from Raymond, his first instinct was to lash back out, to say whatever he gotta say, because he's not gonna let anybody chump him off or punk him out. And that's where the problem pretty much started to escalate from there.
In that conversation, there is some back and forth between Raymond and Shavonda. At one point, Shavonda insults Octavius Brown, and Raymond takes offense to that and escalates the conversation, threatening Shavonda. Shavonda tells him that if he doesn't be careful, he's going to end up in a grave next to his brother, to which Raymond responds, "I bet you see him before I do."
without a doubt a threat that was made. And this is just in the hours just prior to the shooting death of Shavonda Martin.
At that point, Raymond was actually wanted on a separate crime. We felt confident if we can try to get him in jail, maybe we can build a case and ultimately charge him with murder.
In the fall of 2018, authorities are searching for Raymond Burton Jr., the main suspect in the shooting death of Shavonda Martin.
Our detectives were able to actually locate him in Texas, get him arrested, and brought back to Waterloo.
Raymond Burton was placed under arrest for an unrelated intimidation with a dangerous weapon prior to his arrest for the murder of Shavonda Martin.
Soon after, authorities also arrest his accomplice, Denasia Martin, who authorities believe lured her own cousin to his death.
There was no denying that she knew that this was payback. This was a setup.
We sent the U.S. Marshals after her in Norfolk, Virginia, where she was ultimately arrested. We had her transported back to Black Hawk eventually, where she agreed to cooperate with the case.
Denasia Martin pled to conspiracy to commit a forcible felony and was sentenced to prison for an indeterminate sentence not to exceed 10 years.
In April 2021, Raymond Burton Jr. went on trial for murder.
We were sitting in the same room as his family, so emotions is flaring. Both families in the same room, so a lot of tension.
I was real angry. I kept walking out the room. Like, I couldn't hear it all. It was just making me so mad.
Raymond ultimately didn't take the stand. He refused to talk to us.
Raymond was very cool and calm throughout the trial, up until the time of the verdict.
On May 4th, a jury decides his fate.
Ultimately, they found Raymond Burton guilty of murder in the first degree. And in Iowa, any murder in the first verdict is a mandatory life in prison without the chance of parole.
It was a relief, but after they said guilty, I told my family we all got up and hurried up and left because let's not give this chance to boil.
Remind you, this is a small city, small neighborhood where nobody really gets out of it anyway. So after the verdict, after all of this, they're still gonna see each other. And they're gonna see each other every day at grocery stores, picking up their kids from school, just anywhere. And this is something they're gonna have to live with.
The mysterious second shooter has never been identified or brought to justice. And tragically, Shavonda's mother did not live to see Raymond Burton Jr. convicted.
It's months apart, still grieving from our brother. We had to grieve again from our mother.
In September 2018, Diane Martin died in her own home, the apparent victim of a stray bullet in a drive-by shooting.
I seen my mom laying on the floor right there in the kitchen with blood everywhere. So I looked to see if she was okay. I seen her eyes red. And I seen blood like on the stove everywhere from her back of her head. And I seen it and I ran out the house, always to the end of the church by my house. I sat there in front of the door and cried and then go back to the house ever since.
Her murder is still under investigation. We have not made an arrest in it. We don't believe at this time she was the intended target. We believe she was an innocent victim in gunplay.
My auntie was an innocent lady, and she didn't deserve to die at all with no bullet. But, you know, if justice don't come, God got him at the end. Your karma gonna come around.
In cases like this, even though it's been years and years already passed down, there's also beefs that.
On the evening of December 17, 2010, Bristol looked exactly the way a city should look just days before Christmas. Storefronts glowed beneath strings of warm lights. The last commuters hurried through the cold with shopping bags swinging at their sides. Restaurants buzzed with conversations that drifted into the winter air each time a door opened. The streets carried the quiet confidence of ordinary life, the comforting illusion that tomorrow would arrive just as predictably as today. Nothing in those familiar scenes hinted that the city was about to become the center of one of Britain's most unsettling murder investigations. Some crimes begin with violence. Others begin with silence. This one began with a young woman walking home carrying dinner. She had spent the evening with colleagues after work. It had been an ordinary Friday at the end of another working week, the kind of evening millions of people experience without remembering every detail afterward. There were conversations about work, about Christmas plans, about the approaching holiday break. Glasses were raised. Laughter echoed across the table. Eventually the gathering came to an end, and people drifted away one by one into the December night. At around 8 o'clock, security cameras captured what would later become one of the most examined pieces of footage in the entire investigation. A young woman in a dark coat walked through the streets of Clifton. She stopped to buy a pizza. She picked up several bottles of cider. Nothing about her movements suggested fear or urgency. She wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't running. She wasn't arguing with anyone. She simply looked like someone heading home after a pleasant evening out. The images lasted only moments. Investigators would replay those moments hundreds of times. Journalists would study every frame. Viewers across the country would eventually recognize the quiet confidence in her stride. No one watching that footage knew they were witnessing the last confirmed sighting of Joanna Claire Yates alive. Between those ordinary moments and the horrifying discovery that followed, there exists a stretch of time that remains one of the darkest gaps in the story. A front door would close. A struggle would take place. A life would end. Then, while thousands of families decorated Christmas trees and wrapped presents, someone transported a body through sleeping streets before abandoning it in a rural landscape several miles away. For 8 long days, Joanna's family lived inside a nightmare without knowing its ending. For 8 days, her boyfriend searched for answers that refused to appear. For 8 days, police officers chased possibilities that seemed to multiply faster than evidence. The city waited. Christmas arrived. And somewhere outside Bristol, hidden beneath winter branches and exposed to freezing December weather, the truth remained painfully out of reach. When Joanna's body was finally discovered on Christmas Day, the holiday transformed forever for everyone connected to the case. The investigation that followed would grow into one of the largest murder inquiries ever conducted by Avon and Somerset police. More than 70 detectives would work the case. Thousands of tips would flood into the investigation. Hundreds of hours of surveillance footage would be examined frame by frame. Mountains of discarded rubbish would be searched in the hope that one overlooked object might reveal what had happened inside a quiet apartment on an ordinary Friday night. Yet despite the enormous effort, the investigation would soon take an unexpected turn. Public attention shifted away from the victim. A different face began appearing across newspaper front pages. He was an English teacher. Quiet. Intelligent. Eccentric. His appearance alone seemed enough for tabloids to construct a story before detectives had reached their own conclusions. Headlines transformed suspicion into implication. Curiosity became accusation. Within days, a man who had not been convicted of anything found himself portrayed as the villain in the eyes of millions. The damage spread faster than facts. Long before the evidence had spoken, public opinion had already begun delivering its verdict. But the real killer remained free. Watching. Waiting. Perhaps believing the investigation had wandered away from the truth. Eventually, science would accomplish what speculation never could. Tiny traces invisible to the naked eye would tell a story that emotion could not. DNA. Fibers. Digital evidence. Small fragments left behind without intention would slowly assemble a picture investigators could trust. The answer would not emerge through dramatic confessions or cinematic discoveries. It would come through patience, forensic discipline, and countless hours spent following evidence instead of assumptions. When the real suspect finally faced investigators, his version of events sounded almost ordinary at first. A conversation. A visit. An unwanted advance. A desperate attempt to silence someone. But behind those carefully chosen words lay a scene the physical evidence painted very differently. The injuries on Joanna's body revealed determination, resistance, and fear. They suggested a struggle far more violent than the account eventually offered by the man responsible. In the courtroom months later, 12 ordinary citizens would be asked to decide where truth ended and excuse began. Their decision would close one chapter. It would not erase another. Because this story has never been only about identifying a murderer. It is also about how quickly appearances can deceive. It is about how easily public judgment can outrun evidence. It is about a family preparing for Christmas who instead received the worst news imaginable. And it is about a young woman whose final evening looked so completely ordinary that anyone watching her walk through Bristol could have imagined they were seeing themselves. There were no dramatic warnings. No obvious danger. No sense that history was quietly approaching from just beyond the edge of an ordinary winter night. That is what continues to unsettle people more than a decade later. Not because the crime itself was impossible to understand, but because it unfolded inside the kind of routine everyone recognizes. An after-work drink. A takeaway pizza. A short walk home. The familiar click of an apartment door closing behind someone who believed she had safely reached the end of her day. Somewhere after that moment, certainty disappeared. The warmth of a December evening became the cold center of a murder investigation. A missing person became a national headline. A city searching for festive celebrations found itself searching instead for answers. And before justice could finally arrive, investigators, journalists, neighbors, and an entire nation would all learn the same difficult lesson. The first story is rarely the true one. The loudest voice is rarely the most reliable. And sometimes the smallest piece of evidence carries more truth than every headline ever printed. The apartment stood on a quiet street where nothing ever seemed important enough to attract national attention. Neighbors came and went carrying grocery bags, bicycles leaned against brick walls, and lights flickered on behind curtains as darkness settled over the neighborhood. It was the kind of place where routines blended together so completely that one evening looked almost identical to the next. People recognized familiar faces without necessarily knowing names. A polite smile on the stairs, the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the distant hum of a television through shared walls, these were the ordinary rhythms of life inside the building. In December, those rhythms became even softer. Cold air settled over Bristol earlier each afternoon, wrapping the city in long shadows before most people had even finished work. The smell of wood smoke drifted across quiet streets. Church bells echoed through neighborhoods already decorated for Christmas. Shop windows glowed against the darkness, reflecting thousands of tiny lights onto rain-soaked pavement. Every evening carried the same promise that families would soon gather around dinner tables, exchange gifts, and welcome another year together. No one could have imagined that one apartment inside that peaceful neighborhood would soon become the center of one of Britain's most scrutinized crime scenes. When investigators eventually entered the flat, they would search every room with extraordinary care. Every object, every surface, every mark would become part of a silent conversation between the victim and the person responsible. Detectives would spend countless hours trying to understand what had happened inside those walls after Joanna returned home. They would measure distances, examine fibers, photograph furniture, and reconstruct movements that no witness had seen. The apartment itself never spoke. Its silence became part of the mystery. Outside, life continued almost as though nothing had changed. Children laughed on nearby streets. Holiday music drifted from passing cars. People hurried home carrying wrapped presents beneath their coats to protect them from the winter drizzle. Just a few miles away, families were making plans for Christmas lunch, unaware that police officers were already beginning to piece together the opening moments of an investigation that would dominate headlines for months. Every murder investigation begins with questions. Where was the victim last seen? Who saw her? Who spoke with her? What happened during the missing hours? In this case, each answer seemed to produce even more uncertainty. Security cameras had captured Joanna walking alone through Clifton. Receipts confirmed the simple purchases she had made on her way home. The timeline appeared straightforward until the moment she entered her apartment building. After that, certainty dissolved. There were no verified sightings. No emergency calls. No obvious signs of panic reported by neighbors. The ordinary sounds of a residential building concealed whatever unfolded behind one closed door. That absence of certainty would haunt investigators from the very beginning. Criminal investigations often rely on moments people initially consider meaningless. A passing glance through a window. An unfamiliar vehicle parked outside. A brief conversation remembered days later. Tiny observations, almost forgotten, sometimes become the difference between confusion and clarity. But memory is fragile. Especially after tragedy. Once people learned a young woman had disappeared, ordinary memories suddenly felt important. Neighbors replayed the previous week inside their minds. Had they heard footsteps late that evening? Had they passed someone unusual in the hallway? Had they noticed a light remaining on longer than usual? Each recollection arrived carrying uncertainty. Each witness questioned not only what they remembered but whether memory itself could still be trusted. Detectives understood this problem well. Human memory bends beneath pressure. News reports influence recollections. Conversations between neighbors unintentionally reshape details. The investigation therefore had to rely not only on people but on physical evidence that could not be persuaded, frightened, or confused. That commitment to evidence would eventually prove essential. Because as public attention intensified, something equally dangerous began growing outside the investigation itself. Speculation. Television broadcasts expanded hour after hour. Newspapers searched desperately for fresh angles. Commentators filled empty spaces with theories. The public wanted immediate answers. The evidence refused to provide them. In that gap between demand and certainty, assumptions flourished. Faces appeared across newspaper covers. Experts offered opinions before laboratories had completed their examinations. Rumors traveled through workplaces, pubs, online forums, and neighborhood conversations faster than investigators could verify or dismiss them. It became increasingly difficult to separate confirmed facts from confident guesses. The murder was no longer simply a criminal investigation. It had become a national story. Yet amid the relentless attention, one truth risked disappearing behind every headline. A young woman had lost her life. Her family waited through unbearable uncertainty. Friends struggled to understand how an ordinary Friday evening had ended in unimaginable tragedy. Behind every newspaper article existed people answering difficult phone calls, comforting one another, and hoping that someone, somewhere, would provide the answer that had not yet arrived. The emotional weight of those days cannot be measured by police files or courtroom transcripts. For investigators, the case represented evidence waiting to be interpreted. For journalists, it became breaking news. For the public, it became an unfolding mystery. But for those who loved Joanna, every sunrise arrived carrying the same impossible question. Where is she? Hope can survive far longer than logic suggests. Families of missing people often cling to the smallest possibility because the alternative feels unbearable. Every telephone ringing unexpectedly becomes a reason to pause. Every unknown number creates a moment of fragile optimism. Every knock at the door briefly interrupts fear with hope. Those emotional realities unfolded quietly while Britain followed the case through headlines. Then Christmas Day arrived. Across the country, children rushed downstairs before dawn to open presents. Kitchens filled with familiar aromas. Families gathered around tables prepared for celebration. Meanwhile, outside Bristol, in the winter landscape of Fayland, another morning had begun. The countryside looked almost frozen in time. Bare branches reached toward a pale sky. Frost-covered patches of grass untouched by sunlight. The silence of the holiday morning was broken only by occasional birdsong and distant traffic carried by the cold air. It was there that an ordinary walk would become part of one of the most significant criminal investigations in recent British history. The discovery waiting in that quiet landscape would transform a missing person inquiry into a homicide investigation. From that moment onward, every unanswered question would become more urgent. Every hour would matter. Every overlooked detail could become the key to understanding how an ordinary Friday evening had ended in murder. And as detectives prepared to confront one of the most complex investigations of their careers, they still had no idea that the greatest obstacle ahead would not simply be finding the killer. It would also be finding the truth before public opinion convinced the nation it had already been found. The days that followed unfolded with a strange contradiction. The investigation grew louder with every passing hour, yet the truth remained stubbornly quiet. Police vehicles moved through Bristol's streets. Officers knocked on doors from early morning until late into the evening. Forensic specialists disappeared behind protective suits and carried boxes of carefully labeled evidence in and out of the apartment building. Television crews gathered outside, their cameras pointed toward the same entrance where residents now passed beneath the gaze of an entire nation. Behind every lens was the same question. Who had killed Joanna Yates? At first, investigators resisted the pressure to move faster than the evidence. They knew that homicide investigations are often decided not by dramatic breakthroughs but by discipline. Every witness statement had to be checked. Every timeline had to be verified. Every possibility had to be tested against physical evidence rather than instinct. The temptation to reach an early conclusion was enormous, but experience had taught detectives that the wrong answer reached quickly could be far more damaging than the right answer found slowly. Outside the investigation room, however, patience was becoming increasingly rare. News organizations competed for exclusive details. Newspapers searched for fresh photographs, new interviews, and unexplored angles that would keep readers turning pages. Each passing day without an arrest created a vacuum, and that vacuum demanded to be filled. When confirmed facts ran short, speculation often rushed in to take their place. The public watched closely because the circumstances felt deeply unsettling. Joanna had not disappeared while traveling through an unfamiliar city. She had not vanished in a remote location after taking obvious risks. She had simply returned home after an ordinary evening. The familiarity of her routine made the crime feel disturbingly close to everyday life. Millions of people recognized themselves in that final journey through Bristol. Millions had walked home carrying takeaway food after meeting friends. Millions had unlocked their own front doors believing the day was safely behind them. That sense of recognition transformed sympathy into something more personal. People were no longer watching only because they wanted justice for a stranger. They were watching because they wanted reassurance for themselves. The longer the investigation continued without answers, the more uncomfortable that feeling became. Somewhere in Bristol, a killer had gone unnoticed. He had blended into ordinary life. He had walked streets filled with people preparing for Christmas. He had likely exchanged polite conversations with neighbors, visited shops, and continued routines while detectives worked tirelessly to understand what had happened. That possibility unsettled the city far more than any headline could. The greatest danger did not always arrive wearing a recognizable face. Sometimes it looked completely ordinary. That realization would become one of the defining shadows hanging over the entire investigation. Months later, when court proceedings revealed more about the evidence, the public would begin to understand just how important the smallest forensic traces had been. But during those early weeks, investigators possessed only fragments. Each fragment answered one question while creating several new ones. Joanna's final confirmed movements had been established. Her body had been found several miles from home. The post-mortem examination confirmed that she had died as the result of manual strangulation after a violent struggle. Beyond those painful facts, uncertainty still dominated almost every aspect of the case. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. For detectives, it demands patience. For families, it prolongs grief. For the public, it often invites imagination. Imagination, unlike evidence, has no obligation to remain within the boundaries of fact. It can transform coincidence into certainty. It can mistake appearance for guilt. It can create villains long before a courtroom ever examines the evidence. Few investigations demonstrate that danger more clearly than this one. As attention intensified, an innocent man found himself standing at the center of a story he did not create. His appearance, his mannerisms, and his quiet personality became subjects of public discussion. Characteristics that once meant nothing suddenly became reasons for suspicion in the eyes of strangers. Before forensic science had completed its work, before prosecutors had presented evidence, and before a jury had heard a single argument, public judgment had already begun writing its own version of events. It was a reminder that criminal investigations do not take place only inside police stations. They also unfold in newspapers, on television screens, across conversations between neighbors, and increasingly in the court of public opinion. The consequences of those parallel investigations can be profound. Even after the truth emerges, reputations cannot always be restored as easily as headlines are printed. That lesson would become one of the lasting legacies of the Joanna Yates case. But while speculation consumed public attention, detectives continued following something far less dramatic. Evidence. A microscopic trace of DNA. A fiber too small to notice without careful examination. Digital records that quietly preserved movements and timelines. Each piece appeared insignificant on its own. Together, they would eventually reveal a story that no amount of rumor could erase. Justice rarely depends on the loudest voice. More often, it depends on the quiet persistence of facts. Those facts would ultimately identify the person responsible, place him inside the narrative with scientific certainty, and expose the distance between his explanation and the physical reality revealed by the investigation. Yet even after the conviction, one question continued to linger. Not how the crime had been solved. Not why the headlines had gone so terribly wrong. But how an ordinary December evening had transformed so quickly into irreversible tragedy. Perhaps that is why this case continues to resonate years later. It is not remembered solely because a murderer was identified. It is remembered because it forced uncomfortable questions about trust, assumptions, and vulnerability. It asked how well we truly know the people who live around us. It challenged the belief that danger always announces itself. And it reminded an entire country that justice depends not on instinct or appearance, but on evidence examined with patience and care. Tonight, we return to that December in Bristol. Not to sensationalize a terrible crime. Not to relive tragedy for its own sake. But to understand how a young woman's ordinary evening became an extraordinary investigation, how forensic science uncovered what speculation could not, and how one case forever changed conversations about criminal investigations, media responsibility, and the fragile line between suspicion and proof. Because before detectives uncovered the truth, before the courtroom reached its verdict, before the nation learned the name of the man responsible, there was only a quiet winter night, an unanswered disappearance, and a city waiting for dawn without realizing that one of its darkest chapters had already begun. Bristol has a way of appearing gentle at first glance. Built across rolling hills and divided by the winding river Avon, the city carries layers of history without ever feeling trapped by them. Georgian terraces climb steep streets, colorful houses overlook quiet neighborhoods, and centuries-old churches stand only a few minutes away from modern cafes filled with students, architects, engineers, and artists. In December, that contrast becomes even more striking. Ancient stone buildings are softened by Christmas lights strung across narrow lanes, while the scent of roasted coffee and fresh pastries drifts from small independent cafes into the crisp winter air. The city feels lived in rather than hurried, familiar rather than overwhelming. As the final weeks of 2010 approached, Bristol was settling into its holiday rhythm. Office workers counted down the remaining days before Christmas leave. Families squeezed last-minute shopping into busy weekends. Trains carried students back home, while pubs filled with colleagues celebrating the end of another year. Everywhere there was movement, but it was the comfortable movement of routine. People smiled more often. Shopkeepers decorated their windows. Music escaped through open doors whenever customers stepped inside to escape the cold. The weather reflected a typical English winter. Mornings often arrived beneath a pale grey sky, while evenings descended long before dinner. Moisture hung in the air, leaving sidewalks slick beneath passing footsteps. Breath turned visible almost immediately after stepping outside, disappearing just as quickly into the darkness. Streetlights reflected across damp pavement, creating golden ribbons of light that stretched toward distant intersections. It was the kind of atmosphere that encouraged people to pull scarves tighter around their necks and hurry home to warm apartments. Among the city's most recognizable neighborhoods was Clifton. Perched above the Avon Gorge, Clifton blended elegance with everyday life. Wide avenues lined with mature trees met rows of Victorian buildings whose stone facades had watched generations come and go. Independent bookstores stood beside small restaurants. Local grocery shops served residents who preferred walking over driving. On weekends, joggers crossed nearby parks while photographers paused to capture views of the famous suspension bridge disappearing into morning mist. For many young professionals, Clifton represented possibility. It was close enough to the city center to make commuting easy, yet quiet enough to feel like a neighborhood rather than a business district. It attracted graduates beginning careers, couples renting their first apartments, academics from nearby universities, and professionals working in engineering, environmental planning, and design. Life there was rarely dramatic. People recognized familiar faces during morning walks but often knew little beyond a first name. Conversations were polite and brief. A neighbor carrying groceries. Someone locking a bicycle before work. A wave exchanged across the hallway. The quiet trust of shared spaces depended less on close friendships than on the comforting assumption that everyone belonged. That assumption would later become painfully significant. Inside one of Clifton's residential buildings lived a 25-year-old landscape architect named Joanna Claire Yates. To colleagues and friends, Joanna was known for her warmth and curiosity. She had chosen a profession that reflected how she saw the world not merely as collections of buildings and roads, but as spaces where people could breathe, gather, and feel connected to nature. Landscape architecture demanded both creativity and precision. Every park, pathway, and public garden required careful thought about how people moved, rested, and experienced their surroundings. It was work that asked its designers to imagine not only how a place should look, but how it should feel. That mindset suited Joanna. She appreciated details that many people overlooked. Seasonal changes, the texture of stone after rainfall, the balance between architecture and green space, these were not abstract ideas but part of her everyday perspective. Friends described someone who enjoyed being outdoors, who valued conversation, and who approached life with quiet enthusiasm rather than constant excitement. Her apartment reflected a similar simplicity. It was not extravagant, nor was it intended to be. It was the home of a young professional building a future. Books occupied shelves beside practical household items. Everyday routines unfolded there without ceremony. Mornings began with work preparations. Evenings ended with meals, conversations, and plans for weekends ahead. Like thousands of other rented flats across Britain, it was a temporary chapter in a life expected to continue moving forward. Joanna shared that future with her boyfriend, Greg Reardon. The two had built a relationship around ordinary moments rather than dramatic gestures. Friends remembered them as a couple who enjoyed spending time together without needing constant excitement. Weekend walks, meals with friends, visits to family, and conversations about work formed the fabric of their lives. As Christmas approached, they looked ahead to spending time with loved ones during the holiday period, a plan repeated by countless couples across the country every December. There was no indication that those plans would never unfold as expected. Professionally, Joanna worked for a landscape architecture firm where colleagues regarded her as capable and dependable. The office environment demanded teamwork. Projects often stretched across months, requiring collaboration between planners, engineers, architects, and environmental specialists. Deadlines could be demanding, but the atmosphere remained supportive. Like many workplaces approaching Christmas, conversations gradually shifted away from meetings and toward holiday arrangements, family visits, and well-earned breaks. Friday, December 17th, began without anything to distinguish it from countless other Fridays. People arrived at work carrying coffee cups still warm against the cold. Computers hummed to life. Emails accumulated. Meetings filled calendars. Outside, the city continued its familiar pace beneath another winter sky. By late afternoon, anticipation replaced concentration. The working week was ending. Colleagues discussed meeting for drinks after work before everyone scattered for the weekend. Such gatherings were routine. They offered a chance to unwind, laugh about the week's frustrations, and enjoy a few relaxed hours before returning to normal life on Monday. No one present could have imagined how profoundly that evening would later be examined. Every remembered conversation. Every estimated time. Every departure. Details that had seemed too ordinary to notice suddenly became pieces of a much larger puzzle. That transformation, from ordinary memory to crucial evidence, is one of the cruel realities of homicide investigations. Moments dismissed at the time later acquire enormous significance, not because they changed, but because everything around them did. At that point, however, none of the people sharing drinks after work had any reason to believe they were participating in the final normal evening of Joanna Yates' life. The city outside remained festive. Traffic moved steadily through illuminated streets. Restaurant windows glowed against the darkness. Christmas shoppers hurried between stores carrying bags filled with gifts. The sounds of laughter drifted from nearby pubs into the cold December air. Everything suggested that another ordinary weekend was about to begin. History often arrives quietly. It rarely announces itself with obvious warning. Sometimes it slips unnoticed into the middle of familiar routines, disguising itself as just another Friday night until, much later, people begin retracing their memories and realize they had been standing at the edge of a story that would soon capture the attention of an entire nation. As evening settled over Clifton, the neighborhood seemed to exhale. Office lights dimmed one by one while the warm glow from homes and restaurants gradually replaced them. The temperature continued to fall, and a thin layer of moisture settled across parked cars and stone sidewalks. Holiday decorations reflected softly in shop windows, turning familiar streets into scenes that felt almost cinematic. There was comfort in that atmosphere. It encouraged people to slow down, to linger over dinner, to meet friends before disappearing indoors for the night. Joanna was part of that rhythm. By every verified account, she was looking forward to a quiet weekend. Her boyfriend, Greg Reardon, was away visiting family in Yorkshire, a temporary separation that carried no unusual significance. Couples frequently spent a few days apart during the busy Christmas season, especially when work schedules and family commitments pulled them in different directions. They remained in contact, making plans to see one another again after the weekend. Nothing suggested that their final conversations would one day be revisited in police interviews. Those conversations belonged to ordinary life. Plans. Updates. Small details that couples exchange without imagining they might become evidence. That ordinary quality would later become one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case. Joanna had no reason to believe she was saying goodbye. To understand why the investigation resonated so deeply across Britain, it is important to understand what Joanna represented to so many people. She was not famous. She had not sought public attention. She lived the life of many young professionals beginning to establish careers while building relationships, friendships, and hopes for the future. She worked hard during the week, enjoyed time with colleagues, and looked forward to spending Christmas with family. There was familiarity in her story. People watching news reports recognized pieces of their own lives within hers. A rented apartment. A demanding but rewarding career. Friends from work. Plans for the holidays. An ordinary Friday evening. The circumstances surrounding her disappearance therefore felt deeply personal, even to strangers. It challenged an assumption that many people carry without ever consciously acknowledging it, that familiar routines provide a measure of safety. Home represents the end of uncertainty. Unlocking the front door signals that the risks of the outside world have been left behind. The Joanna Yates case would force people to question that belief. Long before investigators understood what had happened, that uncomfortable realization had already begun spreading through public consciousness. The apartment building where Joanna lived reflected the quiet anonymity common to many residential properties. Different lives unfolded behind neighboring walls without intersecting very often. Residents recognized one another in passing, exchanging polite greetings in shared hallways or outside the entrance before continuing with their own routines. Privacy was part of the culture. People respected boundaries. It was entirely possible to live in the same building for months without knowing much about the person on the floor above or below. That sense of quiet independence suited many residents. It also meant that the building carried few obvious clues when investigators later attempted to reconstruct events. Doors opened. Doors closed. People arrived home from work. Lights turned off one apartment at a time. Nothing about those routines appeared remarkable while they were happening. Only afterward did detectives begin asking whether someone had noticed an unfamiliar sound, an unexpected movement, or an encounter that seemed insignificant at the time. Such questions rarely produce immediate answers. Human memory is selective. The brain naturally filters out ordinary moments because they appear unimportant. It remembers surprises, celebrations, arguments, and unusual events far more easily than quiet routines. Yet homicide investigations often depend precisely upon those forgotten moments. A passing glance. A door closing. Footsteps on a staircase. The sound of someone speaking briefly in a hallway. Each detail, however small, can eventually become part of a larger reconstruction. For detectives assigned to Joanna's case, that reconstruction would require extraordinary patience. They were not simply investigating a murder. They were attempting to recover a sequence of moments that nobody realized they needed to remember. Meanwhile, Joanna's workplace continued to process a reality that was becoming increasingly difficult to accept. Colleagues who had laughed with her after work only days earlier suddenly found themselves speaking with detectives. Conversations that had once revolved around holiday plans now centered on timelines and recollections. People searched their memories for anything that might help. Had Joanna mentioned meeting anyone afterward? Had she seemed worried about something? Had anything about that Friday stood out? Again and again, the answers pointed toward normality. Nothing appeared out of place. Nothing hinted at imminent danger. For investigators, that absence of warning was itself significant. Many violent crimes leave behind clear indications of escalating conflict. Previous threats. Documented disputes. Patterns of harassment. In Joanna's case, detectives found no verified evidence suggesting she had been living under such circumstances. Instead, they were confronted with a far more unsettling possibility, that the violence emerged suddenly, without any public warning visible to those around her. As the investigation progressed, officers devoted enormous effort to understanding Joanna's daily life. Not because they suspected her, but because homicide investigations require investigators to know the victim almost as thoroughly as they hope to know the offender. Every confirmed movement, every routine, every professional connection, and every social interaction helps establish what detectives call the victim's world. Who knew her? Who interacted with her regularly? Who might have crossed paths with her unexpectedly? Most of those questions ultimately eliminated possibilities rather than creating them. That process is often invisible to the public. Television dramas compress investigations into dramatic discoveries and sudden confessions. Reality is slower. Detectives frequently spend days excluding scenarios before identifying one that withstands careful scrutiny. Patience, not intuition, becomes their greatest asset. While investigators quietly built that foundation, Britain watched from a distance. The Christmas season continued. Children counted the days until December 25th. Office parties filled restaurants. Families prepared for holiday travel. Yet beneath those familiar traditions ran another story, one unfolding through newspaper headlines and evening broadcasts. A young woman was missing. Then she was found dead. A killer remained unidentified. The contrast between celebration and tragedy gave the case an emotional weight that many people found impossible to ignore. Christmas is often associated with reunion, warmth, and safety. The Joanna Yates investigation unfolded against that backdrop, making every development feel even more jarring. For Joanna's family, however, the calendar no longer mattered. The passing days were measured not by holiday traditions but by unanswered questions. Somewhere within the evidence collected by detectives lay an explanation. Somewhere there existed a person who knew exactly what had happened after Joanna returned home. The challenge facing investigators was not simply finding that person. It was separating truth from assumption before irreversible mistakes were made. That task would soon become even more difficult, because the investigation was about to collide with something almost as powerful as the crime itself. An intense wave of public speculation that threatened to reshape the narrative long before the evidence had finished telling its own story. In the weeks that followed, Bristol became a city living between two realities. One reality continued almost unchanged. Buses followed their routes through the morning traffic. Students hurried toward university lectures with headphones tucked beneath woolen hats. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors before sunrise, swept yesterday's leaves from the pavement, and welcomed customers searching for the last Christmas bargains. The cafes filled with the familiar sounds of steaming milk, clinking cups, and conversations about weekend plans. To anyone passing through for the first time, Bristol still appeared warm, vibrant, and full of life. The other reality existed beneath the surface. It lived in lowered voices between neighbors. It appeared whenever television news bulletins interrupted regular programming. It lingered in newspaper stands where Joanna's photograph stared back at commuters beginning another ordinary day. The city had become the backdrop to a question that no one could yet answer. Somewhere among the thousands of people moving through these same streets was the person responsible for ending a young woman's life. That knowledge altered the atmosphere in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Residents who had once walked home without a second thought now found themselves glancing over their shoulders. Friends texted one another after arriving home safely. Couples chose to walk together instead of separately after dark. Parents reminded their adult children to be careful, not because they believed danger waited around every corner, but because a crime that had seemed unimaginable had suddenly become real. Fear does not always arrive with panic. Sometimes it settles quietly into everyday habits. It changes routines by only a few seconds. A door is locked a little sooner. A curtain is closed a little earlier. A familiar street suddenly feels unfamiliar after sunset. The Joanna Yates case carried that quiet psychological weight. It challenged assumptions that people rarely question until something forces them to do so. The ordinary no longer felt entirely ordinary. For detectives, however, emotion could never replace method. The investigation continued with deliberate discipline. Every confirmed fact was placed carefully alongside every unanswered question. Officers reconstructed Joanna's final known movements minute by minute. Forensic specialists examined physical evidence with painstaking attention. Detectives compared witness statements, verified timelines, and revisited locations repeatedly, understanding that answers often emerge only after evidence is viewed from several different perspectives. There were no shortcuts. The pressure to solve the case quickly was immense, but the responsibility to solve it correctly was even greater. Experience had taught investigators that the most dangerous moment in any major inquiry often arrives when confidence begins to replace certainty. A theory can become so convincing that conflicting evidence is overlooked. Good detectives resist that temptation. They allow evidence to challenge assumptions rather than forcing assumptions onto the evidence. That principle would ultimately define the success of this investigation. It would also expose the failure of others who had reached conclusions long before the facts allowed them to do so. Outside police headquarters, public attention continued to grow. Every development attracted national coverage. Reporters stood outside the apartment building through cold winter mornings, waiting for even the smallest update. Satellite vans occupied nearby streets. Camera operators adjusted lenses toward windows that revealed nothing. Journalists spoke in careful tones about new leads and important developments, while viewers across Britain searched each report for signs that an arrest might finally be close. The intensity of that attention reflected more than curiosity. It reflected identification. People saw in Joanna a life that felt familiar. She represented thousands of young professionals building careers, renting apartments, planning holidays, and imagining futures that stretched comfortably ahead. Her story reminded viewers not of someone living an extraordinary life, but of someone living an ordinary one. That ordinary quality made the loss profoundly unsettling. It suggested that tragedy does not always arrive after warning signs. Sometimes it interrupts routine without permission. Sometimes it transforms an ordinary Friday into the dividing line between before and after. For Joanna's family and friends, that division would remain permanent. Every future Christmas would carry memories of the one that never unfolded as expected. Every familiar tradition would exist alongside an absence that could never truly be filled. While court proceedings and forensic reports would eventually explain many aspects of the crime, they could never restore what had been taken. Justice and healing are not the same. One belongs to the legal system. The other belongs to the people left behind. As this story unfolds, it is important to remember that distinction. The investigation sought answers. The courtroom would determine criminal responsibility. But beneath those processes lay a far more human story, one of interrupted plans, unanswered phone calls, and a future that ended far too soon. This is not simply the story of a murder. It is the story of a city forced to confront uncertainty. It is the story of investigators who chose evidence over assumption despite enormous public pressure. It is the story of how modern forensic science quietly assembled the truth while speculation dominated the headlines. And above all, it is the story of Joanna Yates, a young woman whose life should never be defined solely by the way it ended. Before we step into the events of that December night, before detectives begin following evidence through one of the most closely watched investigations in recent British history, it is worth pausing on one final image. A winter evening in Clifton. Christmas lights reflected across rain-darkened streets. Warm windows glowing against the cold. A young professional finishing another working week, carrying simple plans into an ordinary weekend. Nothing about that moment suggested that history was waiting just a few steps ahead. Nothing hinted that the city surrounding her would soon become the focus of national attention. Nothing revealed that a quiet apartment building would become a crime scene, that microscopic traces would one day speak louder than headlines, or that one investigation would spark lasting conversations about forensic science, media ethics, and the danger of judging guilt before the evidence has been heard. Every story has a point where life still feels completely normal. For Joanna Yates, that point was a cold December evening in Bristol, surrounded by the familiar comfort of routine. The next chapter begins with that ordinary Friday, where colleagues gathered after work, laughter drifted across a busy pub, and no one, not Joanna, not her friends, not the people passing outside, could have imagined they were witnessing the final ordinary hours before everything changed forever. There is a quiet injustice that often follows high-profile criminal cases. The public remembers the crime. They remember the investigation. They remember the name of the person convicted. But the victim, whose life existed long before that single tragic moment, is slowly reduced to a photograph beside a headline. Before Joanna Yates became the center of one of Britain's most closely watched murder investigations, she was simply known as Jo. To her family, she was a daughter whose phone calls never seemed long enough. To her friends, she was the person who could make an ordinary afternoon feel unexpectedly memorable with nothing more than an easy laugh and genuine curiosity. To her colleagues, she was dependable without demanding attention, thoughtful without trying to impress anyone. She was building a life. That simple truth deserves to be remembered before any discussion of how that life was taken. Joanna Claire Yates was born into a close family that valued education, kindness, and quiet determination. Those who knew her often described someone who rarely sought to become the loudest person in the room. She listened carefully before speaking. She noticed details others overlooked. She preferred meaningful conversations over unnecessary drama, and she carried herself with a calm confidence that made people feel comfortable around her. There was nothing theatrical about her personality. She did not need constant attention. She did not measure success by how visible she became. Instead, she invested her energy in people, in work that mattered to her, and in the belief that small improvements could make everyday life better. That outlook naturally led her toward landscape architecture. To many people, the profession sounds abstract. Parks, public squares, walking paths, gardens, riverside developments, these are places people enjoy without often considering the careful planning behind them. Landscape architects imagine how people will experience a place years before the first tree is planted or the first path is laid. They balance beauty with practicality, nature with engineering, creativity with environmental responsibility. It is patient work. The rewards are rarely immediate. The greatest compliment often comes years later, when families enjoy a public space without ever realizing how much thought shaped it. Friends believed that profession reflected Joanna's personality remarkably well. She appreciated the outdoors. She enjoyed walking through different landscapes simply to observe how they changed with the seasons. She noticed textures, colors, and natural patterns that many people hurried past without seeing. Rain falling across old stone. Fresh leaves after winter. The way sunlight altered an ordinary street during late afternoon. These were not dramatic discoveries. They were quiet pleasures. That appreciation for everyday beauty became part of who she was. After university, Joanna began building her career with steady optimism. Like many young professionals in their 20s, she understood that success arrived gradually. There were deadlines to meet, projects to complete, and experience to gain. The work could be demanding, but it also offered opportunities to contribute to something lasting. Colleagues remembered someone who approached her responsibilities seriously while remaining approachable. She worked collaboratively, respected different opinions, and carried herself with professionalism that never felt distant. Office friendships developed naturally around shared projects, coffee breaks, and conversations at the end of long working days. By late 2010, she had settled into a routine that felt both familiar and promising. Weekdays revolved around work. Evenings were often quiet. Weekends offered time with friends, family, or Greg Reardon, her longtime boyfriend. There was comfort in that rhythm. Not because life was perfect, but because it was moving forward. Greg and Joanna shared the kind of relationship that grows through countless ordinary moments rather than dramatic gestures. They supported one another's careers, visited family together, and planned for the future one step at a time. Those who knew them did not describe a whirlwind romance. Instead, they described two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The strongest relationships often look unremarkable from the outside. They are built through routine. Shared meals. Weekend errands. Long conversations after work. Small acts of consideration repeated over months and years. That ordinary stability was part of Joanna's life as Christmas approached. Like many people her age, she balanced professional ambitions with personal happiness. There were projects waiting at work, holidays to enjoy, and plans still unfolding beyond the horizon. Nothing suggested that her future would be measured in days instead of decades. Family remained an important part of that future. Christmas was meant to bring everyone together again. Across Britain, millions of people were making similar plans during December 2010. Travel arrangements had been made. Presents waited beneath decorated trees. Parents looked forward to seeing children return home. Brothers and sisters anticipated familiar traditions repeated year after year. Joanna's family expected nothing different. They expected laughter. Conversations around the dinner table. Stories exchanged after another busy year. Those expectations now carry a heartbreaking innocence because they belonged to people who had absolutely no reason to imagine anything else. One of the most painful aspects of violent crime is the way it interrupts completely ordinary hopes. It does not only take a life. It steals birthdays that will never be celebrated. Vacations that will never be taken. Career milestones that will never arrive. Conversations that families assume can always happen another day. In Joanna's case, those lost possibilities stretch far beyond the details preserved in official records. Court documents can establish timelines. Forensic reports can explain injuries. Police files can identify evidence. None of them can fully capture the future that disappeared alongside the victim. There would never be another promotion to celebrate. No opportunity to grow older alongside the people she loved. No chance to continue shaping the landscapes she cared so deeply about. Those absences cannot be entered into evidence, yet they remain among the greatest consequences of any homicide. Looking back now, it is tempting to search Joanna's life for warning signs or hidden dangers. The evidence does not support such a narrative. By all verified accounts, she was living an ordinary life surrounded by work, friendships, and family relationships that reflected stability rather than turmoil. Investigators found no established pattern suggesting she had anticipated the violence that would later unfold. That fact matters. Not because it explains the crime, but because it reminds us that victims should never be judged through the lens of hindsight. The ordinary details of Joanna's life deserve to stand on their own. She was not simply a victim. She was a professional. A daughter. A partner. A friend. Someone whose future was still being written until it was violently interrupted. As the final working week before Christmas drew to a close, Joanna had every reason to believe the weekend ahead would be uneventful. There would be time to relax after work, enjoy the beginning of the holiday season, and reconnect with Greg after his trip. The routine felt reassuring precisely because it was so familiar. No one close to her could have imagined that those ordinary plans would soon become the final chapter of a life remembered by an entire nation. On Friday, December 17th, the workday began like so many before it. Emails arrived. Meetings came and went. Conversations drifted between professional responsibilities and holiday plans. Outside, Bristol continued preparing for Christmas, unaware that before the night was over, one young woman's familiar routine would come to an irreversible end. Before the events of that Friday became part of a murder investigation, they belonged entirely to the ordinary rhythm of a life that had every reason to expect another Monday. Joanna woke up that morning with the same responsibilities she had carried through countless workdays before. There were projects to think about, colleagues she would see, and the quiet satisfaction that came from working in a profession she genuinely enjoyed. Like many young professionals, her days were rarely dramatic. Progress was measured through completed drawings, discussions with teammates, and the gradual development of ideas that would eventually become real places where people would walk, gather, and spend time together. There is something deeply human about creating spaces intended for other people to enjoy. Landscape architecture asks its designers to think years into the future. A tree planted today may not provide shade for another decade. A public garden imagined on paper may eventually become the backdrop for children's games, family photographs, or quiet afternoon walks. Much of the work happens without recognition, but that had never seemed to bother Joanna. Those who knew her described someone who found satisfaction in the work itself rather than in public praise. That quiet sense of purpose extended beyond her career. Friends remembered someone who valued simple pleasures over extravagant plans. An evening spent sharing a meal, exploring a new walking route, or catching up over coffee could be just as meaningful to her as any elaborate celebration. She enjoyed being outdoors, appreciated nature in all seasons, and found beauty in details that many people overlooked. Winter, despite its shorter days and colder weather, offered its own kind of landscape. Bare branches revealed the structure of trees usually hidden beneath leaves. Morning frost transformed ordinary grass into shimmering silver. Parks became quieter, allowing the sounds of distant birds or rustling branches to stand out against the stillness. It was the sort of environment Joanna naturally appreciated, not because it was spectacular, but because it rewarded those willing to slow down and notice. That ability to notice small things often shaped her relationships as well. People sometimes remember kindness not through grand gestures, but through moments that seem insignificant at the time. Asking about someone's family after remembering a previous conversation. Sending a message to check that a friend arrived home safely. remembering birthdays without reminders, listening carefully instead of waiting for a turn to speak. These quiet habits rarely appear in official biographies, yet they often become the memories people treasure most after someone is gone. When detectives later spoke with those who knew Joanna, they were attempting to understand not only where she had been but who she had been. Victimology, the careful study of a victim's life, is an essential part of homicide investigations. It helps investigators distinguish ordinary routines from unusual events, expected interactions from unexpected ones. In Joanna's case, those interviews consistently painted a picture of stability. She maintained close relationships with family. She had a committed partner. She was progressing in her career. She socialized with colleagues and friends in ways entirely typical for someone her age. Nothing in that picture immediately suggested why she would become the victim of such a violent crime. For detectives, that absence of an obvious explanation narrowed certain possibilities while leaving others frustratingly open. The ordinary nature of Joanna's life made the investigation more complex, not less. Violent crime often appears easier to explain when there is a documented history of conflict or a clear pattern leading toward tragedy. Here, investigators instead found themselves examining a life that seemed remarkably free of those indicators. The challenge became identifying the point at which ordinary routine intersected with extraordinary violence. That intersection would eventually define the entire investigation. Meanwhile, Joanna's family continued living with memories untouched by headlines. To them, she was still the daughter who phoned home, the family member whose place at Christmas gatherings had always seemed guaranteed. Family photographs captured birthdays, holidays, and everyday moments that now carried new emotional weight. Images once taken casually became irreplaceable records of a future that no longer existed. Loss changes photographs. The smiles remain exactly the same. The people inside them do not move. Yet those looking back begin noticing details they never saw before. A familiar expression. The way someone laughed. The posture they always stood in. Ordinary images slowly become treasured reminders because they preserve moments untouched by tragedy. For Joanna's loved ones, those photographs represented a life that deserved to be remembered in full, not simply through the circumstances of its ending. That distinction matters. True understanding of a victim requires more than recounting the crime. It requires acknowledging the years that came before it. The ambitions that motivated them. The relationships that shaped them. The routines that gave structure to everyday life. Only then can we understand the true scale of what was lost. As Friday afternoon approached, the atmosphere inside Joanna's workplace gradually shifted away from deadlines and toward anticipation. The weekend was only hours away, and Christmas was drawing closer. Conversations naturally drifted toward travel plans, family visits, and the welcome opportunity to rest after another demanding year. Someone suggested meeting for drinks after work. It was not an unusual proposal. Across Britain, similar gatherings were taking place in offices, studios, hospitals, schools, and businesses as colleagues marked the end of another working week. For Joanna and her co-workers, it was simply another chance to relax together before everyone disappeared into their own weekend routines. No one thought of it as significant. No one memorized the conversations. No one imagined investigators would later ask them to reconstruct the evening minute by minute. Yet that is one of the quiet cruelties of tragedy. The moments we later wish we had observed more carefully are almost always the ones that felt safest while we were living them. Had anyone known what lay ahead, they might have remembered every joke, every smile, every goodbye. Instead, those memories survived only in fragments, shaped by the limitations of ordinary human recollection. As the workday came to an end, Joanna gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the office with her colleagues. Outside, daylight had already begun fading behind Bristol's winter skyline. The streets were filling with commuters heading home, shoppers carrying brightly wrapped gifts, and groups of friends meeting to celebrate the approaching holidays. It looked like the beginning of another peaceful Friday evening. For Joanna, it was the final chapter of a life defined not by fear, but by kindness, quiet determination, and the ordinary hopes shared by countless young people standing at the beginning of adulthood. She stepped into the cold December air with nothing to suggest that the evening ahead would become one of the most closely examined nights in modern British criminal history. By the time Joanna Yates left work on that December evening, she carried with her all the ordinary expectations of a young woman approaching Christmas. There were no visible signs that anything unusual was waiting ahead. No warning that the familiar streets she knew so well would soon become connected to a national tragedy. No indication that the simple choices made in the next few hours would later be reconstructed by investigators, journalists, and millions of people trying to understand how such a devastating crime could happen. To Joanna, it was simply the end of another week. That is perhaps the most difficult part of looking back at her story. The people involved did not know they were living through moments that would later be examined so closely. They were not aware of the significance of every conversation, every movement, every goodbye. They were simply people continuing through an ordinary evening. Joanna's life before that night was not defined by the tragedy that followed. It was defined by everything that came before. The years of education. The friendships built slowly over time. The professional ambitions she pursued with patience. The relationships she valued. The small routines that gave her life structure and meaning. These details matter because a victim is never only the final moments of their story. Long before investigators created timelines and evidence boards, Joanna was a person with her own memories, preferences, dreams, and plans. She had a past that existed independently of the crime committed against her. She had places she loved. She had conversations that would never be repeated. She had future possibilities that disappeared in an instant. When a person becomes the subject of a criminal investigation, the language surrounding them often changes. They become the victim, the missing woman, or the case. Those descriptions may be necessary for legal and investigative purposes, but they can unintentionally reduce a complete human life into a single event. Remembering Joanna means looking beyond those labels. It means seeing the 25-year-old professional who was still discovering what adulthood would become. Someone standing at the beginning of a career. Someone building a home. Someone making plans. Someone who, like many people her age, was still becoming the person she would eventually be. The tragedy of her death was not only that a life ended. It was that so much of that life had not yet been lived. There were future projects she would never complete. Places she would never visit. Conversations she would never have. Experiences she would never share with the people who loved her. That unfinished future is one of the deepest wounds left behind by homicide. The loss exists not only in what happened, but in everything that can no longer happen. For Joanna's family, that reality became especially painful as Christmas approached. Holidays are built around traditions repeated year after year. The same meals. The same decorations. The same stories told by relatives who have heard them many times before but still smile when they return. Those traditions create a sense of permanence. They make people believe there will always be another Christmas. Another birthday. Another family gathering. Another chance to say the things that sometimes remain unsaid. The death of a loved one shatters that assumption. Suddenly, familiar traditions become reminders of absence. A chair left empty. A message that will never arrive. A name that cannot be called out during a family gathering. For Joanna's loved ones, Christmas 2010 would become permanently connected with the moment their lives changed forever. While the wider public would later focus on detectives, suspects, court arguments, and forensic evidence, her family experienced something far more personal. They lost someone they knew. Someone whose voice they recognized. Someone whose presence had been part of their everyday lives. The investigation would eventually answer questions about how Joanna died. But it could never answer the larger question of what her life might have become. That belongs only to imagination. And imagination can be painful because it reveals everything that was taken away. A successful career continuing to develop. A relationship growing deeper. New memories created with friends and family. A future landscape architect leaving her mark on places that people might one day enjoy without knowing who helped shape them. Those possibilities ended before anyone was ready. As investigators would later discover, Joanna's final evening began in a way that gave no indication of danger. She met colleagues after work, sharing the type of social moment that happens thousands of times every day across cities around the world. People gather after work not because something important is happening, but because ordinary human connection matters. A conversation after a long week. A chance to laugh. A moment to step away from professional responsibilities. Those small moments are often what make everyday life meaningful. For Joanna, that evening should have been one of them. Instead, it became the final known chapter of her story. But even then, it is important not to allow the ending to overshadow everything that came before. The person remembered by those closest to her was not defined by the crime scene photographs, the police investigation, or the courtroom evidence. She was defined by relationships, by ambition, by kindness, by the impact she had on people around her. The investigation into Joanna's murder would eventually reveal painful truths about violence, assumptions, and the dangers hidden within ordinary environments. It would expose failures in judgment and demonstrate the power of forensic evidence. But before all of that, there was simply Joanna. A young woman walking through a city preparing for Christmas. A professional who enjoyed creating spaces for others. A daughter whose family expected to see her again. A partner with plans for the future. A friend whose absence would be felt immediately and permanently. The world would come to know her name because of the terrible circumstances surrounding her death. But those who loved her knew her name for a different reason. They knew it because she was part of their lives. And that is where her story truly begins. Not with the investigation. Not with the crime. But with the person she was before tragedy took her away. On Friday, December 17, 2010, the final evening of Joanna Yates' life began with nothing to suggest that it would become a moment remembered across an entire country. The day had followed the familiar pattern of countless Fridays before it. The working week was ending. Christmas was approaching. The atmosphere around Bristol carried a mixture of exhaustion and excitement as people prepared to step away from their professional responsibilities and enter the holiday period. Offices were quieter than usual, conversations lasted a little longer, and thoughts naturally drifted away from deadlines toward family gatherings, travel plans, and time spent away from work. For Joanna, it was simply another evening before Christmas. She had spent the day at work, surrounded by colleagues who knew her as a talented young landscape architect with a calm and approachable personality. As the afternoon passed, attention gradually shifted from professional tasks toward the weekend ahead. Like many workplaces at that time of year, there was an informal sense of celebration. People were preparing to relax after another demanding week. Later that evening, Joanna joined colleagues for drinks. There was nothing unusual about the decision. Across Britain, thousands of similar gatherings were taking place. Co-workers met in pubs after finishing work, sharing conversations that continued beyond office hours. They talked about the year that was ending, the holidays approaching, and the small personal stories that rarely make it into official records but form the foundation of everyday life. For Joanna, this was one of those ordinary moments. A chance to spend time with people she worked alongside. A chance to laugh after a busy week. A chance to enjoy the beginning of the Christmas season. Those who were with her that evening had no reason to remember every detail. They did not know that investigators would later ask them to reconstruct the timeline. They did not know that ordinary conversations would become important pieces of evidence. They did not know they were witnessing the final hours of a person whose disappearance would soon dominate national headlines. That is one of the most difficult realities of true crime investigations. The moments that later become historic rarely feel important while they are happening. People do not recognize the last conversation they will ever have with someone. They do not know when an ordinary goodbye will become permanent. They do not know when a familiar evening will become a mystery. As the gathering ended, Joanna began making her way home. The route was familiar. The streets were familiar. The city around her was filled with the same signs of seasonal preparation that had existed for weeks. Christmas lights decorated buildings. Shoppers moved through the streets carrying bags filled with gifts. Restaurants and pubs remained busy with people enjoying their own Friday nights. Bristol continued living normally, and within that normality, Joanna moved through the final confirmed moments of her life. At approximately 8 p.m., security cameras captured Joanna walking through Clifton. The footage would later become one of the most important pieces of the investigation because it provided investigators with a confirmed timeline of her final known movements. The images themselves were unremarkable. A young woman walking home. A winter evening. A city street. Nothing in those moments revealed what was about to happen. That was precisely why the footage became so haunting. There was no visible fear. No obvious sign that Joanna believed she was in danger. She appeared to be doing exactly what thousands of people do every night, returning home after spending time with friends or colleagues. At some point during that journey, she stopped and purchased a pizza along with several bottles of cider. Again, the details were ordinary. A simple meal. A few drinks. A plan to return home and continue the evening. Those purchases would later become some of the final confirmed evidence of Joanna's movements. Investigators would use receipts, surveillance footage, and witness accounts to build a picture of the hours before her death. But at that moment, they represented nothing more than normal choices made at the end of a normal day. After buying the food and drinks, Joanna continued toward her apartment. She was heading back to the place that should have represented safety. A place where she lived. A place filled with her belongings. A place connected to her everyday routines. A place where she should have been able to close the door behind her and feel secure. Instead, that apartment would later become the center of one of the most complex murder investigations in modern British criminal history. The exact sequence of events after Joanna returned home remained hidden during the early stages of the investigation. Detectives knew when she had last been seen. They knew where she lived. They knew when concern was first raised. But between those points existed a gap, a period of time that contained the answer to the most important question. What happened inside that apartment? The uncertainty surrounding those missing hours would become the foundation of the investigation. Police would eventually determine that Joanna had died from manual strangulation after a violent struggle. The injuries identified during the post-mortem examination revealed that her death was not the result of a sudden, painless event. There had been resistance. There had been a confrontation. There had been a moment when a young woman fought against what was happening to her. Yet those moments remained unseen. No neighbor reported witnessing the attack. No passerby knew what was occurring. No one outside the apartment understood that a tragedy was unfolding behind a closed door. That silence would become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Residential buildings are filled with people living separate lives only a few meters apart. Behind every wall, different stories unfold. People cook dinner, watch television, make phone calls, and prepare for sleep. Most of the time, those walls represent privacy and comfort. But on that night, one apartment contained a crime that would later shock the entire country. The investigation would reveal that the person responsible was not a stranger who appeared from nowhere, but someone connected to the same building. That discovery would make the case even more unsettling because it challenged the comforting belief that familiarity always means safety. However, in those first hours after Joanna entered her apartment, no one knew that. Her boyfriend, Greg Reardon, was away on a trip. The separation was temporary and completely ordinary. There was no reason for concern. There was no reason to expect that anything had changed. But as the hours passed, Joanna did not respond in the way people expected. A normal evening became an unanswered question. An unanswered question became worry. And that worry would soon become a desperate search for answers. The tragedy of Joanna Yates' final night lies in how normal it appeared from the outside. A drink with colleagues. A walk home through familiar streets. A simple purchase of food and drinks. A return to an apartment. Every detail belonged to ordinary life. Yet somewhere between those ordinary moments, something happened that would transform a quiet Bristol neighborhood into the focus of a nationwide investigation. The final hours of Joanna's life were no longer simply memories shared by those who knew her. They became evidence. They became a timeline. They became the beginning of a search for the truth. The hours after Joanna returned home passed without anyone outside the apartment realizing that something was wrong. That was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of what followed. The world continued moving. Cars traveled through Bristol's streets. People returned from Christmas shopping. Families prepared for the weekend. Neighbors went about their evening routines. Inside one apartment, however, a life had been interrupted in a way that no one yet understood. For investigators, reconstructing those missing hours would become one of the greatest challenges of the case. There was no single witness who could provide a complete account. No person standing nearby who saw exactly what happened. No immediate explanation that could connect the last confirmed sighting of Joanna walking home to the moment she was later discovered dead. Instead, detectives had to work backward. They had to start with what was known. Joanna had been alive when security cameras captured her walking through Clifton. She had purchased food and drinks. She had returned toward her apartment. After that, the timeline became uncertain. Every investigation contains moments where certainty disappears. These gaps are where detectives spend much of their time because the answers often exist inside them. The challenge is finding a way to turn absence into information. In Joanna's case, that meant examining everything around the gap. Her movements. Her relationships. Her environment. The physical evidence left behind. The people who had crossed her path. The building itself. The apartment where she lived was not an isolated location. It was part of a community of residents whose lives intersected through shared spaces. People passed one another on staircases. They entered and exited through the same doors. They lived close enough to hear ordinary sounds of daily life, yet separate enough that many interactions remained unnoticed. That combination of closeness and distance would become central to understanding the case. Modern apartment living often creates a strange type of anonymity. You can share walls with someone for months or years without truly knowing them. You may recognize a face without knowing a story. You may exchange greetings without ever learning someone's name. This familiarity without intimacy can create a false sense of security. People feel surrounded by others, yet they may still remain strangers. As investigators examined Joanna's final hours, they had to consider every possibility. Was the person responsible someone known to her? Someone who entered her home willingly? Someone who encountered her by chance? Each possibility required careful examination. Early assumptions could not be allowed to determine the direction of the investigation. The evidence had to lead. That principle became increasingly important as public attention intensified. The disappearance of a young woman just before Christmas naturally created a powerful emotional response. People wanted answers quickly. They wanted reassurance that whoever was responsible would be found. They wanted the uncertainty to end. But criminal investigations do not move according to public expectation. They move according to evidence. And evidence often requires time. While detectives worked to understand Joanna's final movements, those closest to her were experiencing something far more personal. Greg Reardon, Joanna's boyfriend, expected to return and continue their normal plans. Like any ordinary couple separated briefly by travel and family commitments, there was no reason to believe anything had changed. A missed message might seem insignificant. A delayed response might seem explainable. At first. But concern grows differently from fear. It begins quietly. A thought that something feels unusual. A message sent again. A phone call made one more time. A person checking details they would normally ignore. Then the realization begins forming that something is not simply inconvenient. Something is wrong. When Greg returned on December 19th and found Joanna missing, the situation changed immediately. Her absence was not consistent with her normal behavior. Her belongings remained at the apartment. Important personal items had not been taken. The details surrounding her disappearance suggested that she had not simply decided to leave. A missing person inquiry began. But as officers examined the circumstances, the possibility of something more serious quickly emerged. The apartment did not tell an easy story. There were no obvious answers waiting to be discovered. No note explaining where Joanna had gone. No simple explanation that would allow everyone to breathe with relief. Instead, investigators were faced with uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that families of missing people know too well. Every possibility remains open. Every hour feels heavier. Hope and fear exist at the same time. For those searching, the hardest moments are often the quiet ones. The moments between phone calls. The moments when there is nothing new to report. The moments when people try to convince themselves that an ordinary explanation still exists. Perhaps she was delayed. Perhaps her phone battery died. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding. These possibilities can provide comfort temporarily. But they also become increasingly difficult to hold on to as time passes. By the time police became involved, the investigation began moving rapidly. Officers started gathering information about Joanna's final known movements. They reviewed available surveillance footage. They spoke with people who had seen her that evening. They examined the apartment and began building a timeline. The case was no longer simply about finding a missing person. It was about understanding why a young woman who appeared to be returning home normally had disappeared. The answer would eventually be found through a combination of traditional detective work and advanced forensic analysis. But before that could happen, investigators first had to face the most painful development of all. The search for Joanna would not end with her safe return. It would lead instead to a discovery that transformed the entire nature of the case. On Christmas Day, while many people across Britain were celebrating with their families, Joanna's disappearance reached its tragic conclusion. A walk in the countryside. A discovery by strangers. A moment that changed everything. The missing person investigation became a murder investigation. And suddenly, every unanswered question became more urgent. The final journey Joanna had taken was no longer simply a matter of finding where she had gone. It became a search for the person who had taken her there. The peaceful streets of Bristol, the apartment where she had lived, and the quiet landscape outside the city were now connected by a chain of events that investigators would spend months trying to reconstruct. The ordinary evening that began with drinks after work had become the beginning of one of Britain's most closely watched criminal investigations. And at the center of it all was one question that demanded an answer. Who was responsible for the death of Joanna Yates? The question would remain unanswered through the first days of the investigation. Who had entered Joanna Yates' life that night? Who had turned an ordinary journey home into a crime scene? Who had taken away a future that was still unfolding? For investigators, the search for answers began with the final confirmed moments of Joanna's movements. Those moments were painfully ordinary, and that made them both valuable and difficult. There was no dramatic confrontation captured on camera. No obvious encounter with a stranger. No clear indication that Joanna believed she was in danger. The footage showed a young woman simply making her way home. That image would stay with many people who followed the case because it represented the unsettling reality of what happened. Joanna did not appear to be walking toward danger. She appeared to be walking toward safety. She was returning to the place where she lived. The place where her belongings were kept. The place where she had every reason to believe she could close the door and leave the outside world behind. Instead, something happened that would eventually expose the fragility of that assumption. Home is often considered the final barrier between a person and the dangers of the outside world. It is where people remove their coats, prepare meals, answer messages, and begin the private part of their day. It represents comfort because it is familiar. That familiarity made the crime even more disturbing. The investigation would reveal that Joanna's death was not the result of a random event in a distant location. It was connected to a place where people lived ordinary lives, where neighbors followed routines, and where the sounds of everyday existence continued while investigators searched for the truth. The contrast was difficult to comprehend. A quiet residential building. A peaceful neighborhood. A young woman beginning her adult life. And behind one door, an act of violence that would eventually bring national attention. As detectives continued examining the timeline, they began looking at every person connected to Joanna's final days. This process is standard in homicide investigations. It does not mean that every person examined is considered guilty. It means investigators must understand the victim's world completely. Who did Joanna know? Who had contact with her? Who could have had an opportunity? Who had information they did not yet realize was important? These questions formed the foundation of the investigation. At the same time, forensic specialists began working with evidence that would later become crucial. Modern investigations often depend on details too small for human senses to detect. A microscopic trace left behind. A pattern on a surface. A digital record created without anyone thinking about it. The smallest pieces can sometimes reveal the largest truths. But in those early days, investigators did not yet have the complete picture. They had fragments. A missing woman. A recovered body. A timeline with unanswered gaps. A community searching for reassurance. And a family facing a reality no one should have to experience. The discovery of Joanna's body on Christmas Day changed everything. Before that moment, there was still a possibility, however uncertain, that the investigation might end with a different outcome. Families of missing people often hold on to that possibility because hope remains powerful even when circumstances become frightening. But once Joanna was found, hope was replaced by grief. The investigation changed direction immediately. Police were no longer searching for someone who might return. They were searching for someone responsible. The countryside where Joanna was discovered offered a sharp contrast to the busy streets of Bristol. Away from city life, the landscape was quieter. Fields stretched beneath the winter sky. Trees stood bare after the autumn leaves had fallen. The cold air carried the stillness of a place where few people expected anything significant to happen. Yet that location would become one of the most important places in the entire investigation. It represented the final stage of a journey that detectives needed to understand. How had Joanna arrived there? When? By what means? And who had been responsible? Every answer required another question. Every discovery created another line of investigation. The police response grew rapidly. Resources increased. More officers became involved. Specialists were brought in. The scale of the operation reflected both the seriousness of the crime and the determination to identify the person responsible. But major investigations are rarely solved through one dramatic moment. They are built through thousands of careful actions. A witness interview. A forensic examination. A piece of footage reviewed again and again. A detail that seems insignificant until viewed alongside other evidence. The public often sees the final breakthrough. They rarely see the patience required to reach it. In Joanna's case, that patience would become essential because the investigation faced several challenges at once. The first challenge was identifying what happened inside the apartment. The second was determining how Joanna was moved after her death. The third was finding the person whose actions connected those two locations. And the fourth was protecting the investigation from the pressure surrounding it. Because as the case gained attention, the search for answers was no longer taking place only inside police stations and forensic laboratories. It was happening publicly. Millions of people followed updates. Newspapers published theories. Television programs analyzed every development. The demand for a resolution became stronger with every passing day. But the truth could not be rushed. A person could not be convicted because the public wanted someone to blame. Evidence had to support every conclusion. The investigation had to continue carefully, even when the world outside wanted immediate answers. That balance would later become one of the defining themes of the Joanna Yates case. The search for justice required not only finding the person responsible, but also avoiding the mistakes that can happen when emotion moves faster than facts. In the days ahead, detectives would follow many possible paths. Some would lead nowhere. Some would create new questions. Some would bring intense public attention. There would be suspicion. There would be controversy. There would be moments when the investigation appeared to move in the wrong direction. But beneath all of it remained the same goal: to discover what happened to Joanna. To understand the events hidden behind the silence of that December night. And to ensure that the final chapter of her story was not written by rumors, assumptions, or fear. It would be written by evidence. The morning of December 25, 2010, arrived with a sense of celebration across Britain. For many families, Christmas Day began before sunrise. Children woke early, eager to open presents. Kitchens filled with the familiar smells of holiday meals being prepared. Living rooms became gathering places where relatives exchanged greetings, shared stories, and continued traditions repeated year after year. But for Joanna Yates' family, Christmas morning carried a different kind of silence. The hope that had remained through the previous days was about to disappear. For more than a week, Joanna had been missing. The search had dominated local attention and increasingly captured national interest. Police officers had worked through the holiday period. Friends, colleagues, and family members waited for news, holding on to the possibility that the uncertainty would end with Joanna returning home. Instead, the investigation reached its most devastating turning point. Several miles outside Bristol, in the rural area of Fayland, Joanna's body was discovered. The location was far removed from the busy streets where she had last been seen. The landscape offered a quiet contrast to the city that had become the center of the search. Fields stretched beneath the winter sky. The roads were calmer than usual. The cold December air covered the area with a stillness that felt almost disconnected from the activity happening elsewhere. The discovery was made by a couple walking their dogs. It was an ordinary Christmas Day activity. A walk through the countryside. A chance to spend time outdoors during the holiday. Neither person could have expected that their routine journey would place them at the center of a major criminal investigation. The moment they realized what they had found changed the nature of the case forever. Until that point, Joanna's disappearance had been a missing person investigation. Now, detectives were facing something far more serious. A murder investigation. The emotional impact was immediate. For Joanna's family and friends, the painful uncertainty of not knowing had been replaced by a devastating truth. The possibility of her coming home safely was gone. The questions changed. They were no longer asking where she was. They were asking what had happened. And who was responsible. For investigators, the discovery created a new set of urgent priorities. The location had to be preserved. Every detail mattered. The position of the body. The surrounding environment. Any object nearby. Any trace that could reveal how Joanna had arrived there. A crime scene is not only a place where something happened. It is a record of events. Every movement leaves behind information. Sometimes that information is obvious. More often, it exists in tiny details that require careful scientific examination to uncover. Officers secured the area while forensic specialists began the difficult process of collecting evidence. The work required patience and precision. A single overlooked item could become significant. A single contaminated piece of evidence could damage an entire investigation. The landscape itself became part of the story detectives needed to reconstruct. How long had Joanna been there? How had she been transported? Had the person responsible traveled alone? Had anyone seen something unusual? Each question represented another path investigators needed to explore. The post-mortem examination provided the first major answers about how Joanna had died. Medical examiners determined that she had been killed by manual strangulation. The findings also revealed evidence of a violent struggle. Joanna had suffered injuries consistent with resistance, showing that she had fought against what was happening to her. The examination did not indicate sexual assault, but the evidence confirmed that her death involved a physical confrontation. For investigators, those findings were critical. They transformed an unknown tragedy into a clearer picture of the violence involved. But for Joanna's loved ones, medical explanations could never lessen the pain. A forensic report could describe the cause of death. It could not describe the person who had been lost. It could not explain the future that would never happen. It could not restore the conversations, celebrations, and ordinary moments that had disappeared. As news of the discovery spread, Bristol reacted with shock. The city that had been following the search now faced the reality that many had hoped would never come. People who had never met Joanna felt connected to the case because they had watched the search unfold. They had seen her photograph. They had heard descriptions from those who loved her. They had followed every update, hoping for good news. Instead, they witnessed the transition from hope to grief. Flowers began appearing. Messages of sympathy were shared. The name Joanna Yates became associated not only with a crime, but with a community's mourning. Yet alongside the grief came another emotion: urgency. The person responsible was still unknown. The investigation had identified what happened to Joanna, but not who had done it. And that meant the search was only beginning. Detectives now faced the enormous task of connecting the final moments of Joanna's life with the person who had caused her death. The distance between her apartment in Clifton and the location where she was found became a critical part of that investigation. Somewhere between those two places was the journey. Somewhere within that journey were decisions made by the person responsible. Somewhere were the traces left behind. The investigation would eventually depend on those traces. Not dramatic revelations. Not public speculation. Not assumptions based on appearances. Evidence. The days ahead would bring thousands of hours of investigative work. Officers would examine surveillance footage, interview witnesses, analyze forensic material, and follow countless leads. Some would prove important. Many would lead nowhere. That is the reality of solving a murder. Behind every major breakthrough are often hundreds of unanswered questions and countless hours spent searching through possibilities. The discovery on Christmas Day marked the moment when the investigation entered its most challenging phase. A young woman who had left work, spent time with colleagues, bought food and drinks, and walked home through familiar streets was now at the center of a homicide inquiry. The ordinary details of her final evening became extraordinary evidence. The places she visited became locations to examine. The people around her became potential witnesses. The timeline of her last hours became a puzzle that investigators needed to solve. And as Bristol entered the final days of 2010, detectives began a race against time. Because somewhere in the city, someone knew more than they had revealed. Someone carried the truth of what happened that night. The task ahead was finding them.